And we'll get started. So my name's Amy McCosker. I work for CQ University, and I am here today to speak to, or to listen to Sally Benneman's presentation as well. Sally is an animal welfare coordinator with the New South Wales Department of Education, and we're going to move on to her presentation really soon. Before that, I thought I'd just give everyone a quick introduction to the project. So Farm Safety has a range of partners, as you can see. CQ University, AgForce, New South Wales Department of Education, and it's funded by the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. And for today's session, just to let everyone know, because of the webinar format, we won't be able to actually take questions directly from people. So we'll need questions to go into the chat function or the Q&A function down the bottom. And as I mentioned, we're recording today's session too, just so we can share it with anyone who hasn't been able to attend live. So with all that said, I'll stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you, Sally.
Good afternoon, everybody. So some of you may know me. I'm not sure how many of you come from New South Wales. And this is obviously going across to people in other states of New South Wales. So my role as the Animal Welfare Coordinator is to look after all schools in New South Wales and help them with their compliance issues, and also to support them in their practices so that they deliver good educational outcomes to their students, but also that they have support in running. Most of them run small farms and what they do with their livestock. Good animal welfare is essential because it's what gives us successful, productive, ethical and sustainable enterprises. And not just when they say sustainable, it's not just about environmentally sustainable. It's sustainable enterprises because the animals are not only well handled and well managed, but that means that they will live longer, have less health issues, all those sorts of things, and become environmentally, economically, and socially more sustainable. So one of the most important parts of good animal welfare is good livestock handling. And it's one of the ways that everybody can improve their animal welfare. In the last sort of 20 years, there's been an increase in awareness about good animal welfare and good animal handling. And I think Temple Grandin is probably the best known person in the world who has been the advocate of that. So if anybody's interested, I'd recommend you Googling Temple Grandin. She's a very interesting character in more ways than one, but she's really been somebody who has made some really outstanding contributions in this area. So today's presentation is going to focus mostly on sheep and cattle. We're not going to be looking at other livestock, and some of the principles that we talk about may relate to other species, but in this case, we're focusing on the sheep and cattle. We're also not going to be focusing on how to manage animals that you're showing. This is about extensive situations where your handling animal is in yards and you're moving them out of paddocks into races and crushes and doing animal husbandry management practices with them. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so why is good quality handling essential for good welfare? Well, stock that are handled properly are safer for themselves. They're less flighty and therefore they're less likely to injure themselves. And of course, they're less likely to injure the handlers. Wherever you have good handling, you have less stress on the animals, which if they're beef animals, then you're going to have less dark cutters. It's also going to mean they're more productive. You have increased biosecurity issues, increased biosecurity when you have good handling, because you're less likely to stress those animals, so they're less likely to become unwell, and therefore you have healthier animals and you have reduced sickness and disease and injury. Okay, we go to the next one. So what is the benefits of good livestock handling? It's increased farm labour efficiency, because if animals can move through a race and through a crush with only one person, or maybe one person and a dog, that's going to be a whole lot better than paying for two or more people. It's also going to mean it's going to happen more quickly. The animals are going to come in regularly, and therefore you can guarantee that a practice is going to take a certain period of time. And therefore, you're going to have better productivity in terms of your costs for your labour, but also your animals are going to be healthier and less likely to have injuries. It's going to decrease your feed costs because animals that are more stressed have poorer feed conversion ratios. You're going to have less need for veterinary care and medical costs or veterinary costs, and you're going to have less mortality rates, lower mortality rates among your animals. Next slide. So the way your livestock behave is really a result of three things. The amount of handling that they've had. Animals that are handled from a young age and are used to humans are obviously easier to handle. You see that particularly with animals like dairy cattle that are handled a lot, and the quality of that handling. So if they've been handled a lot, but that handling has been very poor and people have been yelling at them, hitting them, making them feel uncomfortable, then they're going to have a negative response. And why would any animal want to come into the yards and have anything done to them, whereas every time they come in, somebody is unpleasant to them? They're not stupid. They're not going to like to do that. So you're going to have to make that a pleasant experience, or at least a less stressful experience. And then there also the other thing that affects their behaviour is their genetics. So some animals are genetically more prone to be calmer, and others are more flighty. And that occurs across between species and between breeds and within a breed with particular individuals. And we'll look at that a little more later. Okay, next, please. One of the most important things in livestock handling is to know your animals. And the best way you can know your animals is to observe them regularly. I always say to students is one of the most important features of good animal welfare is good observation. You need to know what is normal and what is not normal. It's also, you need to know what their physical characteristics are, so you understand what their vision, what their smell is like, all those sorts of things, what they're capable of. And then you also understand their behavioural characteristics. So you know that sheep and cattle are generally herd animals. They like to stay together, that kind of thing. So you use those characteristics. You also know what their temperaments are like, and you know which ones could be more problematic than others. And you also think about what type of stock are they. Are they young animals? Are they older animals? Are they pregnant animals? Are they lactating animals? That's really important and affects how that you handle those animals. Next. Okay, so if we think about observation and what do we need to know when we observe our animals, one thing we know is that we know what their herd structure is. They're always within herds, and this is probably, it applies to both sheep and cattle, but it probably applies mostly to cattle show this mostly, but sheep do to a certain extent. So you have those in the herd that are the leaders and those that are followers, and the most insecure ones or the ones that are most flighty. And they're generally the ones that stick in the middle of the mob. So you look at how that herd structure is, and then you note the behaviour of certain individuals. And a lot of good stockmen can tell you the numbers on the tags of those individuals that can be problematic, or those ones that are the easiest to manage. It also tells you, by a good observation, you also know what the health of the herd is like, and that gives you a really good idea of any physical injuries, things like that, or just general state of health. And it also gives you patterns of behaviour, and you see certain animals that always do certain things, and you can take that into account, and you can maybe, as the worst case scenario, if that pattern of behaviour is really bad, then you say, well, maybe that's an animal that we cull into the future. All right, so if we now look at the next slide, which talks about the physical characteristics of the animals, and it's really important to understand the vision. The most important characteristic physically that we look at is the vision, their hearing, and their smell. So in the next slide, if we look at what about their vision, sheep and cattle are animals that are preyed upon, and so in that they have eyes on the sides of their heads. So that means that they have great panoramic vision, but not such good binocular vision. Cattle can see up to 330 degrees around them. So that gives them a really wide line of sight. But that is using one eye at a time. Sheep have between 190 to about 305 degrees, so not quite as wide as cattle do. But the impact of that is that they don't have such good binocular vision. So if we go to the next slide, Amy, it should show us what we mean by that. So if we see there on each side of the animal, we have that wide range of panoramic vision. And in the front, we only have a very narrow, small area of binocular vision, and that's where they focus with both eyes. And that's in comparison to someone like humans that have a much wider binocular vision. So what does that mean? And then behind them, they do have a blind spot. So what does that mean when we're handling them? It means that they can detect sudden movements a lot better than humans can, but they're very slow to focus on close-up objects. So that that means that when they're coming through yards and things like that, they often have to, if there's a jumper or something hanging on a gate, they often have to turn and be able to look at it quite clearly to know what it is. So if you want to push those animals past some sort of an object like that, then you often have to give them a bit of time. If you just keep forcing them, they'll just turn around and run away from it. But if you actually let them see it and give them time to actually focus on it, then they're more likely to walk past it. It also means that you don't walk behind an animal and then suddenly walk out from behind it, because that's the time when you're more likely to get kicked, because you'll come into view and they won't know that you've been behind them. So you have to consider those things. And it's like us, if someone creeps up behind us and jumps out from somewhere, we're going to have a fright. So cattle and sheep are going to behave in a particular way when they do get a fright, and that's going to cause them to move and be erratic in their movements. They also have more, if we think about their hearing, they're much more responsive or more sensitive to high-pitched noises. So things like yelling and cracking whips and dogs with high-pitched barking and clanging metal really does cause them a lot more stress. So if they're young animals, or they're animals that haven't been used in the yards, been in the yards much before, then it's really important to try and keep those noises down. They can point their ears in opposite directions, and so that means that they can pick up noises from both directions. So even though we think something might be on one side of them and they shouldn't know what it is, they will be able to detect that. Okay, if we now start looking at their behavioural characteristics, so if we go to the next slide, the things we need to think about with cattle and sheep are that they're animals that are preyed upon, like we said before. So therefore, they like to be together in a herd. They like to be with their friends. And so that's why when you move them, when you're moving them around, you try and keep them with their friends. You try and keep them together in their herd or their flock, because it's once you start to separate them, that's when you have the biggest problems. So if you do need to draft animals off, then you need to be prepared for that and have a proper plan for that. The other things that can affect their behaviours can be the sex of the animals. We also, in general, entire male animals tend to be more aggressive, although there are plenty of bulls and rams that are not, but they do tend to fight amongst themselves more, so that when you're moving them, you need to consider that. And also their stage of life or their production. So if they're animals that are pregnant or they're lactating and they have young with them, then you need to assess how that's going to affect their behaviour, because they'll be more protective of their young. And if you want to start moving them, you need to ensure that you keep the calf or the lambs with the mothers. They're less likely to move efficiently if they start to get separated. And the other thing to think about is their flight zones. So, and we'll talk more about this, that every animal and every mob or herd have their own flight zones. We go to the next one. So here we have a picture of what we mean by a flight zone. So when somebody moves, or it's how the flight zone is the area around an animal that you can get to before that animal starts to move. So this we did as a sequence of photos where when that person in the green shirt was standing still, the animals were quite close to them. Then as they moved, the animals moved away. So it's how responsive those animals are. So some animals have incredibly small flight zones that you can almost walk up to them and pat them, whereas others, almost as soon as you go in the paddock, they take off. They also have a flight zone as a collective, so that a mob of sheep or a mob of cattle, they will have a flight zone that they might mob together and stay for quite a long time. And then when you get just that 1 or 2 steps closer, they'll then break off and move. And that's the measure of their flight zone. So we use that flight zone to know how to move those animals. And those animals with that are typically like Bos Indicus cattle tend to have a bigger flight zone than Bos Taurus cattle. But it also depends on how much handling they had. And like we said, what that quality of that handling has been. With constant good handling, the flight zone of most animals and most mobs can be decreased. It's not rocket science. It's just all about being calm and consistent with your animals. So if we move to the next one, Amy. So the temperament of animals, and it's important, temperament is a very highly heritable trait. So a lot of producers these days focus on that, and they tend to cull animals that have difficult temperaments. So those animals that are more flighty, that don't cope so well in the yards, they tend to get rid of those and cull those, because they do generally they pass those characteristics on, and those animals tend to not be as productive. They're a lot more dangerous, and they're a lot more time consuming. So it's a really important thing to consider that, so that if you're giving animals regular, consistent handling and their temperament doesn't seem to be improving and their flight zone isn't decreasing, then maybe you have to think that the genetics is playing a very strong part in this, and maybe those animals will never be any better. And I think particularly when you're using animals in schools, it's really important to have have animals with good temperaments. There's the safety of the students, but you also want your students to have good experiences, and you don't want them to have bad experiences with animals that are unpredictable and are very flighty. All right, if we go on to the next one. So a really big impact on how you manage your handling of your stock is to consider the type of the stock that you've got. So if you've got animals, mothers with offspring, that's really important to consider that, because those calves or lambs will be more easily stressed, and the mothers will be more stressed at keeping up with them and staying with them, and that'll add to confusion in the yards. So it's really good to handle if you're doing anything with young animals, say landmarking or things like that. You try and do it early in the day, so that if they do get separated, then before the end of the day, they've got plenty of time before the end of the day to find their mothers and mother up again, and therefore they'll all be more settled for the evening, and you'll have less loss of productivity. If you've got pregnant females, they tend to be slower, and if you're moving them for any distance, you really need to be able to take your time with them, because obviously they're going to be carrying more weight, they'll get thirsty more quickly, and they just won't cope with it. So particularly if it's hot weather, you need to really do that in the early morning and be mindful of giving them rests and plenty of stops so they can drink. The other type of stock, the next type, is those animals that have just been weaned, and they can be some of the hardest. So if you've got a mob of young cattle that have just come off their mothers, they can be very hard to handle, only because they have no herd structure. They haven't had time to develop the leaders and the less dominant ones and the followers, and so therefore nobody kind of takes the lead, and so they're as the saying goes, it's like herding cats because nobody's taking control here. So often what happens in situations in a lot of remote properties, what they do is they actually practice, when they wean their animals, they actually run them through the yards quite a lot, and they do what's called weaner training to actually try and help them develop a herd structure. So into the future, they're easier to handle. And they found that the cost of and the time in putting that in with young animals actually saves them money and makes them more efficient into the long run. You have to also consider if they're bulls and rams, they often have an established group structure. So if you're used to keeping particular rams and bulls together in one particular paddock, when you sort of start moving them around, you'll then end up having a bit of fighting. So you often have to keep that in mind, and not just because it becomes time consuming, but also because sometimes they will injure each other, and that's not what you want, because therefore decreasing the value of those stock. If you've got old and compromised stock, there's two things that they can be. They can either be extremely cunning. Sometimes older cows can be quite difficult to handle because they know how to get around things, and they know what works for them. Same with old ewes. But you just need to take that into account. Also, if they are a bit compromised, then you have to just be mindful. And those animals that have had limited or poor handling, you have to really focus on giving them good experiences. Because if you get animals from some other source where they haven't had good handling, then you're obviously going to have to try and undo some of those bad lessons that they've had. So let's have a look at the next slide and think about some of the things that we need to do if we're going out to move animals. So the general rule is plan and prepare. So know what you want to do. Don't just go out, oh, we're going out to get those animals today and we're going to move them here and there and everywhere. You need to know, where are you taking them from and where are they going to, and what is the most efficient route for those. Sometimes that might mean taking them on a longer trip if that means that the route there is easier for them. If you're going to try and push animals through creeks, things like that, or really narrow crossings, that can sometimes be a very difficult thing. It also means if you're taking them on a road or crossing roads, you've got to think about, have you got signs up, and do you know what the sort of traffic is like in that area? So first thing, prepare your yards. This doesn't mean, some people used to say it means open all the gates. It doesn't necessarily mean open all the gates. Just make sure that the gates that you want open are open and the gates that you want shut are shut. So if you're taking them down the road and you're going past someone else's paddock and their gate is open, well, then you make sure you shut that gate before you go past so that those animals aren't going to end up in your neighbour's place. Ensure that all the people that are working on that job know what the plan is. So you don't get out on the road there or out in the paddock and then you suddenly say, oh, why the hell are you taking them to the left? We should be going to the right. Make sure everybody knows what the plan is. Consider the weather and plan accordingly. If you know it's going to be a stinking hot day, maybe get out there early and do it before the weather gets too hot. It might also mean that if it's really hot, you might want to put some sprinklers on in the yards. You might want to make the conditions in the yards less dusty and more comfortable for when everybody gets there. And then evaluate the herd prior to handling. So make sure you've gone out and have a look at them. You know what type of stock you've got. You know what their status is. And do you know that they'll all fit into those yards? Not much point arriving with a huge mob of sheep and finding there's only room for half of them. And what the hell are you going to do with the rest of them? So some of these things sound common sense, but until you're actually there and it's all happening, you won't know whether it's all going to plan. Okay, next slide, Amy. All right, so what are the principles of good stock handling? You can sum them up as 4 things: position, pressure, movement, and communication. So it's how you use each of those ones in any situation that's going to give you the best outcome. So basically the position is that it's your position as the handler in relation to the animal's eye. So the animal has to be able to see you, so for you to be able to influence it. to move somewhere. So if you want it to move through a gate, if it can't see you, then it's not going to move through that gate. So usually you work the animals on the side, and some people like to work them from the hip. Some people like to work them from the shoulder. It doesn't really matter. It's just that it's what's called the point of balance. And where you generally, if you start on their shoulder and use that as your point of balance, if you walk towards their head, then they're going to walk backwards. If you walk from their shoulder to their tail, then they're going to walk forwards. Obviously, the closer you get, then the more likely, as you come in adjacent to the animal or perpendicular to the animal, the closer you get, the more likely it's going to move. So that's what's called the pressure. So the greater the pressure you put on it, the closer you get to the animal, the more likely it is to move. But once you get that movement, the most important thing is to release that pressure, because that's like the reward. If you keep going closer and closer, that's when the animals will go faster and faster. So if you move into the animals, they move in the direction you want, you stop, or you may even step back. Depends how much movement you get from those animals, how responsive they are to you. So you can only decide how much pressure that you have when you know what kind of animals you have, but you're always responding to that, and you need to be light on your feet and moving quickly. And then there's the movement. So any movement you have, some people, jump, some people wave something, there's all these different theories about what you can use. And it doesn't really matter what it is, whether you're using, some people call them livestock talkers, some people put plastic bags on the end of sticks. They have all sorts of different theories. Some people just jump, but it's that movement that causes the animal to move. So an animal that has a very small flight zone, you can probably jump in the air and it will only move marginally. An animal that has a very large flight zone, the more a slight movement may cause it to move quite dramatically. So again, it's just responding to those animals that you've got in there. And then there's the communication, and it's always important to be talking to the other people you're working with. People aren't mind readers, and if they don't know what you're trying to do, if you're trying to put an animal up into a race and you don't tell them that, then they might be standing in the way and stopping that happening. All right, if we go on to the next slide. So one of the most important things to do is to use the animals' natural instincts. So when we're moving a mob of animals, what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep them going forward in a consistent movement, not too fast. We don't want them to run. We just want them to walk along in a nice, consistent way. But once we gather those animals together, to keep that movement going, there's no point just walking straight behind that mob of animals. You've actually got to zigzag across behind those animals. And that doesn't matter if you're walking or you're on a bike or you're on a buggy, and if you watch a dog, they will do this instinctively. They will run from one side of the mob to the other behind the mob. The reason why they're doing that, because instinctively they know that will create the movement. And why will that create the movement? That is because each time you go to the outside, you will come into the line of sight of those animals. They'll see you and they'll move forward. And then you go back to the other side and they'll see you and they'll move forward. So it is always good to keep that movement up in that zigzagging behind the mob. And obviously how close you get to them and how fast you need to move is dependent on the flight zone and the temperament of those animals. All right, if we go on to the next one. Okay, so when you get them into the yards and you've got your gates all nicely prepared and the animals have come in and you want to move them through a gateway, it's always important to stand on the inside. The reason why that is because of the way animals see you and their desire to stay away from you, they will move around you in a curved line. So if you were to stand on the outside of that fence there, you would not get nearly as good a response as you do by standing on the inside. People stand on the outside and yell and scream and say they're not moving. Well, they won't move, but you need to be on that inside so that they can move through you in a calm way. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So it's always important in your yards, whatever it is you're doing, that you've got the right equipment and you know how to use it. No point getting there, you got all your animals, you've got your yards all ready to roll, and you don't know how to make your crush work. So you need to do a little bit of homework sometimes, you need to prepare, and you need to make sure things are in good working order. Okay, we go to the next. All right, so when we put our animals into our yards, it's important that we only half fill the yards. The reason for this is that you actually allow yourself as the handler to get in and move around the yards. If the yards are really packed, then you can't get in and you can't create any sort of easy movement. The next thing to remember is if you put animals from one yard into the next, if you go and shut the gate, the animals will always go back. Particularly cattle do this. They go back and look at the gate from when they came. And that's okay. Give them a chance to do that. They'll go back and they'll see that gate's shut and they won't try and go through that. So things like that, it's often about taking time, allowing the animals to see things. It's like when you put the pressure on them, you put the pressure on, let them move. You don't just keep applying the pressure and forcing and forcing. Most animals will be quite cooperative and you want to encourage that. All right, we go on to the next one. All right, if you've got slide gates, things like that, then you need to make sure that they're either completely open or completely closed. A slide gate like that, that's half open, is more likely to damage the animal if they go through and they bang their hip on it, or their side of their head or their shoulder. And also as a person, they're more likely to injure you if they then push that gate open and you're in the way. Next slide. The principle of parallel movement is a very simple one, and that diagram just shows it quite clearly. If you've got the animals that are moving in one direction, if you walk along the outside of the race in the opposite direction, they will move forward because you're moving along past their point of balance. So we're using that same principle. And then when you want to go back up to the top of the head of the race, you move away and walk in that sort of V shape, come back in and move along the race again. And that will keep the movement happening. If you've got animals that aren't very responsive, you can use a flapper or something like that to increase that movement and therefore get them to move along that race. What people don't understand is they stand there yelling at them, but they actually aren't going to go anywhere. You've actually got to create that movement. And once you create that movement and you keep it happening, the animals will keep moving through. Okay. Next one. It's really important to know how to restrain your animals. So mostly with cattle, it's essential that you have a good crush. And you may have a head bale that you can trap their head in. And then also, sometimes there's also a lifter that allows you to hold the head up as well. If you've got the option for all those things, they all make your life a whole lot easier. The lifter isn't as essential, but it is important to have a crush with a head bale that you can catch the animals. It's also really good if you have a crush that has a back opening where something like a vet can get in and easily, if it's got a half gate there, that they can get in and they can examine an animal but not run the risk of being kicked. So good equipment that you can restrain. Most people have a race for their sheep, and they can see that they can see a lot of things about their sheep while they're in the race. Not many people, in a school situation, would have a sheep handler, but increasingly large properties are now having them more and more. That allows you to catch the animal, tip it on its side, and have a good look. If you can't do that, then with a sheep you can always just catch it manually, and tip it up and restrain it that way. And once the sheep is resting on its backside against your legs, most of the time they'll sit there in quite a relaxed fashion. But it really is important that you know how to restrain those animals. Okay, next one. Yard assessment. Lots of people write extensively about how having the best yards is the best way for livestock handling. Obviously, good yards are really good, but it's not absolutely essential. But what you do need to have a look in your yards and find out what are the hazards and what are the things that are likely to cause you problems. Some of those hazards can be removed or controlled. So if there are things hanging on gates, if there are things that are banging, all those sorts of things should be taken off so that it makes your job a lot easier. Make sure you know the pathway into the yard, so you know which way the cattle or the sheep generally flow and where do you want them to come out the other end. Identify anything that may hinder them, even to the sake of knowing sometimes when you're trying to run them up into a shearing shed, it will even depend on which way the slats in the floor are running that might actually cause them to balk, because if they can see the light in a certain way, if the slats are running so perpendicular to them, then they're more likely to balk than if they're running across parallel. Make sure that all your gates and latches, not much point having a gate that doesn't have a latch on it. You need to be able to shut things. You need to know how many people are going to need to complete the task and how many pens you're going to need for the animals. So it's about having a good look and knowing exactly what you're going to do when you get those animals in there. It's too late once your animals are all there and you can't fit everything in. Okay, we're nearly at the end of this. So, there's lots of different ways, different aids that can be used when you're moving stock. Sticks or polypipe, they should not be used to hit the animal. They should be used to extend your arm or to hold on to a flapper. They can give you greater movement so that you can get greater response from your animals. Electric prodders should only be used when essential. They are not something that should be used by students, and it should only be used in certain circumstances. If you've got dogs, they need to be trained. No point sending a dog out there that isn't trained. It'll only cause more trouble than it's worth. And if they are prone to bite, then they should be muzzled. And that's not cruel to the dog. It's just that some dogs, when they get in situations, particularly in yards, and they get a bit scared, then they tend to be a bit nippy. Best is to put a muzzle on them, and then they can't bite anything. And if you're going to use livestock talkers or goads or flappers, they can often be really good, but they should only be used, as I said, to make like for a longer arm or to make something that visually flaps and creates movement in those animals. Okay, that brings us nearly to the end. And on the Animals in Schools website, and that's where all New South Wales teachers who use animals should be familiar with. There's a whole lot of videos and a whole lot of information in that sheep and cattle section that goes through that. Some of those videos are quite short and you can just see certain things if you scroll through the area on cattle or sheep, and it will give you resources that you can use with your students or you might want to look at yourself. And that's about it, Amy. How are we doing for time? And those are my contact details if anybody needs to get in contact with me and ask me some more information or advice.
Perfect. We'll leave those up there while we answer a couple of questions because we've had a few come through, Sally.
Yep.
Are you right to keep going?
You don't, good time. Yep.
Yeah, you don't need a drink of water or anything, or you're right to keep going?
No, I'm right. Yep.
You've just given a great presentation, so much information and so much experience. My colleague, Amy Cosby, said about 30 plus years. Is that right?
Yeah, I've been doing this job for 20 years and before that about another 14 teaching. So
you've definitely seen it all. And that was sort of one of the questions that I had myself listening. Obviously, you've got a lot of confidence in working in this field. For some of the newer teachers that might be listening, you know, and you've kind of answered it there with your second last slide with that resource there, but what's your advice to newer teachers? Do you think that you know, they should avoid having animals on school farms for a while until they're more confident, or should they be networking with other teachers or industry members so that there's someone on site that's really confident with looking after farm animals? Or what do you think?
I think start small. So depending on their experience, you know, I mean, I know, you know, say I'll start with poultry, but that's a good place to start, you know, get a hang of that. And then maybe move into sheep. I don't advise people to have cattle unless they've either got a lot of experience themselves or they've got somebody nearby that is really able to support them, or they've got another teacher at the school. Cattle can, you know, they're just a whole lot. They're a different ballgame. They're larger. They can be more flighty, that sort of thing. So, you know, start small if you feel like you haven't got the skills, and do as much professional learning as you can. And also, you know, made up in New South Wales, we have really great local land services vets. I'm sure in other states they have other government vets and people like that who are prepared to give them advice.
And that sort of leads well into the next question, which is from Anita. She was wondering, is it possible to retrain animals? You know, if you're a teacher that's sort of come in and inherited the school farm, and you've got some concerns about the flightiness of the animals or different things like that. I suppose it comes down to, as you mentioned, some of it's inherited and some of it's taught. Yeah. How long would you persist with animals that you're not quite happy with, and when would you draw the line and start to consider buying some new ones?
Well, I think if you've got animals, and it would depend on whether they're sheep or cattle, but if you've got animals that, you know, have a bit of questionable behaviours that you feel uncomfortable with around students, start by bringing them into the yards and maybe giving them supplementary feeding that way, so they are there and they're starting to respond to you. They know that your humans are bringing them food. So, and that way then also when the students come down, they're exposed to the noise, they're exposed to the activities of the school environment. Do that for, you know, several weeks. And if after that time you feel like they are improving, then yes, maybe move to the next level of whatever it is you want to do with them, start to run them through the race, that sort of thing. If they respond and they seem like they're improving, yes, judge how they're going. If they're not responding and you feel like, you know, this is just a waste of time and money, maybe it's time to move those animals on, because as I always say, difficult animals cost just as much as, if not, or not, maybe more to keep than easier, better animals. So, you know, poor quality animals can be as expensive, can cost you the same as good quality animals. So why not have good quality animals?
And how would you seek out those good quality animals? Like as someone who maybe is new to the community, or do you contact an agent and discuss it that way, or what would you do?
I start by meeting a few people in the area and asking them if you're in a rural area and there's community members who have animals, as much as sometimes people are being very generous and they say, we'll donate you an animal, just be mindful, because sometimes they're donating it because they think they want to get rid of it. And so just be mindful of that. It isn't always the way. Some people can be really good. If they're a local producer and they say, you know, that they've got some animals that they'd be happy to loan to you or donate to you, maybe go out to the farm and actually look at the animals. Say, can I come and work in the yards for a day? Can I learn something myself? Can I see what those animals are like? Sort of go in with the best knowledge, because once you've got the animals on your school farm, if they are difficult, that then creates a whole lot of other issues. How do you get rid of them? That kind of thing. So just be a little bit wary. But yeah, start by doing that. Beware about buying animals at the sale yards unless you do know their history, only because they might be fantastic, but they may not. So I think word of mouth is good. Seeing what those animals are like is really good. Or there might be another school that has some animals that you could get some from, because then you know that those animals are used to a school environment.
So you would seek out either young animals that you could train or older animals that have already been in a school environment.
Yeah.
Another person, who was that? Kate, I think, was also wondering how much preparation / induction do you in a school want to give to students before they have any hands-on experience with? I suppose it depends on what animal we're talking about, doesn't it? And I noticed a lot of your pictures featured older students. Is there an age limit or a experience limit that you put on before you start letting students mix directly with animals or be inside the yards?
Well, really, it just depends on the type of animals you've got. In New South Wales, the most likely time that students are going to be with in that situation would be in what we call year 9, stage 4. So they're going to be about 14, 15 years old when they elect to do agriculture as a subject. That's when you would most likely let them in to the yards. But again, you would choose those animals that are better handled, more used to humans before you put some younger, less experienced. Sometimes what you can do, if you've got older students, they can help the younger students, so they can kind of model some really good behaviours, so that if you want to have a group of older students and the younger students can watch how they actually do it, that kind of thing, particularly in some schools where they have activities at lunchtime or out of, after school or at sport time. That's the time then you get, different age groups helping each other. But it's really just about you observing those animals, feeling comfortable with how they're responding to humans, and then just judging, whether you think those students are ready for that. But you'd start also by having the animal in the crush, ensuring that the students feel comfortable with working with them in the crush, and they're used to that sort of, because some students find even the size of a steer quite confronting. So, but they need to be able to get up close, kind of get that feeling of understanding the size and the sort of feel and smell of the animal, because that can even be confronting for some students.
And would you be running through flight zones and those different types of things in the classroom beforehand, or in the yards?
Definitely, yeah. You'd be showing them some of the videos, putting them through all that sort of stuff, and then going and modelling it for them in the farm.
It's a lot of responsibility, isn't it? Like, there's probably not another subject where you're sort of introducing, in some cases, quite large animals to children and trying to keep everyone safe.
Yeah. And look, and other people, sort of think, sheep are quite good because in a school environment, they usually become very used to humans quite quickly. They'll respond to a bucket of feed and things like that. But that in itself can become problematic, because as soon as they see you come out with a bucket of feed, they can just come racing at you. And some of them can be quite sort of assertive, and people shouldn't think that, sheep aren't going to hurt you. They won't sort of attack you as such, but they can knock you over. A few of them that are 80 kilos plus try and get the bucket of feed out of your hand. That can also be quite problematic. So while working with them and feeding them like that can be good, you also need to have them a bit more respectful of you and not sort of knocking you over, because that can be very stressful for students too.
Have you had it in any sort of school situations decided that a certain group of students just isn't ready, even though, you're saying, say, the grade 9s, for example, that the plan is for them to go in with the animals, but then at that point as a teacher, you don't feel comfortable with that? Is that, obviously it's a teacher's responsibility to think at some point these kids aren't ready and keep them out?
Oh, look, and even within a class, there may be some students who feel more comfortable and have more skills, and just their own temperaments allow them to manage it better, whereas some other students might be either a bit more anxious, they might be not as familiar with large animals, they just naturally a more nervy student. So those you would just keep them back, let them sit outside and watch until they feel comfortable. And also you just have to also assess, some students might not want to try something because they think they'll look silly, or they're lacking confidence. So maybe on a day that some of the more assertive students aren't there, you might let some of those other students, encourage them to have a go. It's about classroom management and just assessing both the temperament of your animals but the temperament of your students.
That's what I was going to say. At the beginning of your talk, you talked about assessing the animals. It sounds like you've also got to keep it, because they do feed off each other, don't they? Animals around nervy people become nervy animals as well.
Yeah. And they also don't. A nervy student is going to move more quickly and do sort of respond in a way that's going to perhaps have an impact on that animal. And it won't be that the animal's responding because wants to be nasty. It just gets a fright too, and then it can knock the student over, and then everybody's upset.
Mm-hmm. I think that's all the questions, unless anyone else has another question. I'll give you just a few moments to put it into that chat box as we sort of wrap things up. But I think that's everything. So thank you so much today for your presentation, Sally.
Right.
I think it's been really, really valuable. You've covered a lot of ground there, and we shared your contact details there, and also that fantastic resource for students, for teachers to be able to share with students or watch themselves. But as Sally said, she's definitely open to being contacted, and we can, if you didn't get a chance to write that down, feel free just to respond to the email that I sent around with the details for today, and I can link you up with Sally that way as well. And we'll also be sharing this webinar and our discussion on our website and on YouTube as well, so that people can come back at a later date. We have had quite a few requests for that. So thank you so much for your time today, Sally.
Not a problem.